Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. This is an after-hours video. I know, right? I never actually officially retired this format of doing things, it's just been a little over 3 years since I felt like actually using it. And why is it coming back, you might be asking? Well, there was a comment, and my god, it's a doozy of a comment. So in the video, Eugenics doesn't care about your feelings, I talked about how Eugenics doesn't care about your feelings. Eugenics would work if you applied it to a population. We have applied it to animal populations for millennia now. I have given some up-to-date examples. For instance, we've looked on this channel before at times where eugenics was applied to guppy fish populations, so that researchers who were doing experiments could breed different populations out of a single starting genetic pool. We've also touched a little bit on how eugenics has been applied to certain mouse populations. That was when we looked at the mouse utopia experiment. Suffice to say, the conclusion of the video was that eugenics could work hypothetically if you applied it to a population, and that eugenics is basically just the term for when we apply selective breeding theory or genetic breeding theory to humans. There was no advocacy either for or against eugenics in that video, merely the observation that it would work, and then we touched a little bit on the end about some of the potential outcomes of applying such a thing to humans. Obviously there was the acknowledgement that yes, if you wanted to breed humans in a certain direction you could, and that would be beneficial if you were aiming for one particular outcome. But we also touched on the fact there are a lot of potential pitfalls to applying such a thing to a human population. For instance, the possibility of inbreeding depression, that's when you end up with a really small gene pool and you start getting all sorts of problems as a result of that. And we also mentioned that certain genetic advantages, while they may be advantageous in one time or location, if you took that particular animal and you put it into a different place or into a different time, then that so-called advantage might then be actually disadvantageous in that time or location, because obviously the environment may be different, and if you're too specialized to one environment and then you end up in a different environment, well, your specialization may very well end up being your downfall. And we also mentioned the possibility of lack of disease resilience. That is, if you get a certain disease, be it bacterial or viral, it may very well affect one person in a population or a small part of a population, but if you have a large genetic diversity and it attempts to attack other people, well, they may have genes that give them some sort of inherent resistance to that bacteria or virus. So if you have a small gene pool, then you may find that everyone in that entire population ends up getting this particular disease because there's less likelihood of there being some sort of genetic resilience. So lots of points about how a selectively bred population can either be good or bad, and how the supposed good or supposed bad is more or less circumstantial. It depends on a load of variables, some of which you simply cannot take into consideration. Going back to the disease example, and that seems somewhat relevant in the current time period that we're going through, we don't know if there's going to be some random new disease that comes out of seemingly nowhere, and we don't know what that's going to do, how widespread it's going to be, and we don't know how much it's going to mutate, or whether it's going to mutate, or what it might mutate into if it does. It may become more virulent or less virulent, and of course, the less genetic diversity you have in a population, you're basically just more at risk of this thing going through the entire population. And there's really no way of predicting when this may happen. So again, lots of points for and against brought up. This apparently annoyed someone, and it annoyed them so much that they left an incredibly scathing comment on that video. And the only reason that I'm going through it now is because it's a fascinating look into the psychology of the far-left wingnuts that exist on all sorts of social media. So I'll just read through the comment and you'll see why I'm bringing it to your attention. It is just fascinating. The psychology on display here is so very interesting. So the comment goes as follows. You are either stupid or you are lying. Your "what the fuck I love eugenics now" pearl clutching is disingenuous. Given that I just wasted 30 minutes of my life that I can never get back, let me make people's objection absolutely unquestioningly clear. The problem is not that you made a video about the fact that eugenics works for values of the term works. No, what makes people think you are a Nazi advocating for eugenics and masking your true goals is the fact that you just spent 30 minutes making a Nazi using blacks and athletics and IQ without telling Nazis to fuck off. You completely slipped out of discussing any potential ethical answers to the question of eugenics. Are you a Nazi? Who the fuck cares? If you are a Nazi or just Nazi adjacent, it is completely irrelevant to the fact that this video is irresponsible at best and malicious at worst. No one, absolutely no one, is making the argument that eugenics doesn't work. Great straw man, though. The argument which you failed to address is, should we practice eugenics, and if so, to what degree? Should we draw lines? If so, why those lines? First of all, to deal with the claim that this is a straw man argumentation, well, there was someone in the video, and I'm just going to quote them. They posted this on Twitter, talking to Richard Dawkins. They said, "You absolute pin-headed simpleton. It doesn't work in practice because too many of the goals turn out to be arbitrary fantasies, and too many of those fantasies are the pet projects of abusive bigots who fuck up any civilization they get their hands on. Are you new here? Christ." So yes, that person is just saying that eugenics doesn't work. The fact that there are other people who are just doing the smug pseudo-intellectual, what does work mean? Well, that heavily implies something, doesn't it? When you sarcastically ask someone a question like that, there is an implication behind the question that you're asking. Addressing the so-called pearl-clutching disingenuousness. So you say you're either stupid or you are lying. Your "what the fuck I love eugenics now" pearl-clutching is disingenuous. Disingenuous herein meaning, of course, not being straightforward about something, not being entirely honest about something, pretending to be unaware or pretending to not know something. So the assertion here is when I sarcastically do the "what the fuck I love eugenics now," which of course in internet parlance is incredibly sarcastic, and pretty much always used in a joking or insincere manner, that's disingenuous, which of course according to this person means that I am in fact advocating for Nazism and eugenics. Hence the later quip about masking your true goals. It's funny how these far-left wingnuts always seem to know better what's going on in your head than you do, isn't it? Even though, to quote the video that I made, I'm just going to read from the script here, I said, "I'm going to put the disclaimer here as if the previous several minutes of this video wasn't enough. Just because I am demonstrating that something is possible, that does not mean it should be done. Just because you can do something, that doesn't mean that you must, or that you should, or that it is even a good idea to." Later in the video I said this: "An adaptation that may be advantageous in one location, or in one time period, may not be advantageous in another, or may even worse be disadvantageous in another time or location. As such, what is considered to be a best gene or a series of good genes may be entirely circumstantial. Of course, the biggest risk of any sort of eugenic policy or any sort of eugenic concept is the idea that it may be abused, that people may use eugenics and the objective truth of genetics and selective breeding to push for things that have nothing to do with the betterment of a gene pool. The disruption of a gene pool on the quest for so-called superior genes could lead to various problems, such as loss of genetic diversity, inbreeding depression, or long-term problems regarding immunity and species resilience to things such as widespread disease. Some of these things will be very difficult, if not impossible, to take into consideration because, simply put, we don't know what's going to happen in however many 100 years' time." So as you can see, there's no disingenuousness here, there's no true intention that is being masked. I made it pretty clear in that video that while you could selectively breed a population, the odds of you being able to continuously selectively breed one population that is optimum to an environment, especially when you cannot predict reliably what that environment is going to be in the future, it's not really going to work very well. While it works on paper from a technical selective breeding standpoint, going any further than that, trying to put it out into a wider populace with unknown variables of the environment, you're going to start running into more and more problems. All of that taken together, I thought made pretty clear that I don't think eugenics should be applied to any population. Also, the relative insanity of this part of the comment. You spent 30 minutes making a Nazi using blacks and athletics and IQ without telling Nazis to fuck off. How exactly I spent 30 minutes making a National Socialist is, well, I'm not even sure where to begin. There wasn't any particular discussion about National Socialism in that video, nor any of its policies, nor its actions. Also, eugenics was not a strictly Nazi thing to do. Yes, the National Socialist government did publish guidelines about what they called racial hygiene when it came to whom could marry whom, but that is not the only time or place that eugenics has been applied. This idea that eugenics is a uniquely Nazi thing really needs to be retired because it's not true. Might I remind you about the Soviet government's use of Lysenkoism, also Lamarckism. So Lysenkoism stood in opposition to the theory of evolution, and Lysenko, with Stalin's approval, actually had many geneticists in the Soviet Union executed. This was of course because they stood against Lysenkoism. Lysenkoism was one of the major components when it came to the Holodomor, which was the Great Famine, which resulted in the death of millions of Ukrainians. It was a loss of life which frankly dwarfed the Holocaust. So Lysenkoism, when applied to crops, postulated that a parent could pass on characteristics to its children. This included traits which came via use or disuse. Vernalism is the attempt to induce a plant's flowering process by exposure to prolonged cold, or either of winter or of some artificial equivalent. This combined with Lysenko's idea that if you planted crops really close together so that their roots intermingled, he had this socialist idea that if you did this, all of the plants would share their nutrients equally through their entangled roots, which of course we know is absolute pseudoscience. It doesn't work. And so he combined principles such as these, and that pretty much annihilated most of the agriculture in the Soviet Union. This was the result of a eugenic policy. Now obviously this was applied to plants. However, Lysenko was also an advocate of applying eugenics to human populations. Indeed, in an essay he penned in 1934, he wrote, "While the romantic numbskulls of Nazi Germany are dreaming of restoring the old race of Europe's dark forest to its original purity, or rather its original filth, you Americans, after taking a firm grip on your economic machinery and your culture, will apply genuine scientific method to the problem of eugenics. Within a century, out of your melting pot of races, there will come a new breed of men, the first worthy of the name of man." This was of course when he was writing about America adopting communism. So yeah, Trotsky and by extension Stalin and communism in general, quite big proponents of eugenics. It was also part of their reason for the whole class warfare against the bourgeoisie sort of thing. So eugenics is not a uniquely Nazi thing. Whenever anyone is talking about eugenics, that does not make them a Nazi, nor does it mean that they support Nazism, or anything along those lines. Eugenics was pretty standard fare in the field of science in the first half of the 1900s. As to the bizarre part about making a Nazi using blacks and athletics and IQ without telling Nazis to fuck off, none of that involved the creation of a Nazi. As for the idea of using blacks, in Dawkins' original tweet, which is what we were talking about, he mentioned making humans better runners and better jumpers. I simply took his example and, well, showed that it is absolutely possible. The fact that the best runners in the world are black, well, that came up as a result of the studies talking about leg architecture and the importance of leg architecture when it comes to running economy and overall speed and general running ability. The fact that most of the best runners in the world happen to be black Africans, well, that's kind of just a byproduct of that studying. You find that a particular leg architecture happens to be beneficial towards running, and black Africans are just more likely to have that particular leg architecture owing to the genes of that population. There's no moral anything about that, it simply is. And this idea that you're making a Nazi by doing all of this without telling Nazis to fuck off. I have to question what sort of bizarro land logic and argumentation is this. If you are not expressly stating that you despise Nazism and you think Nazis should go away, that somehow makes you a Nazi or Nazi adjacent. This is, for lack of a better term, batshit insanity. I actually published a video about this because it's such a prevalent phenomenon. It was the one titled, "You Didn't Say X, Therefore Bias." The idea that not mentioning something proves you have a position or a stance on something. It is absolute absurdity. And I've got to say, in this particular comment, this user didn't actually tell Nazis to fuck off. They told other people that that's what they should be saying, but they didn't say it themselves. So I assume, by that logic, that this user must be a Nazi or Nazi adjacent. Because that makes sense, somehow, apparently. The idea that it is irresponsible or malicious to talk about the objective truth of genetics and how you could apply selective breeding to a population, this is absurd. There is nothing irresponsible about simply noticing that genes exist and that they can be passed on. That is all selective breeding is. There is a gene here, there is a gene there. If you have these two animals which carry these genes breed together, then that gene will be passed on. And then we say, okay, these genes or this gene has this effect, this gene has this effect. We could have that passed on to the next generation. There's nothing irresponsible about that. There's no malice in it. There's no emotional anything. There's no moral anything. It is simply an observation of objective scientific fact that is how genetics and breeding work. I am so very sick of people attempting to impugn some sort of motive or impugn some sort of morality on people when they simply observe that something is true. And then to the final part. The argument which you failed to address is, should we practice eugenics, and if so, to what degree? Should we draw lines? If so, why those lines? That actually was addressed in the video. Again, to simply quote the script, eugenics is not going to be applied to an already existing population. It is something which is going to be done preemptively to the unborn. If you had your baby genetically screened and you were told it had Down syndrome, would you terminate the pregnancy? If the answer is yes, you just made a eugenic decision. What if you were told, instead of terminating the pregnancy, that you could remove the extra chromosome that is causing the problem? Again, that is a eugenic decision. What about the concept of so-called designer babies? The idea that in the future you may be able to choose the colour of your children's eyes or the colour of their hair. This is a eugenic decision. To people out there who doubt the validity of IQ as a valid indicator of people's intelligence, your own child could be born with genes that have been negatively correlated with IQ, or genes which have been positively correlated with high IQ. Which do you choose? At that point in time, I guarantee you every single one of them will become a eugenicist and say they want the genes that are correlated with high IQ. As our ability to map and influence genes improve, and as we gain the ability to do this to people before they are even born, and as we move towards hypothetical technologies like the artificial womb, the ability to choose the genetics of your children is going to come back into the public light. So when it comes down to eugenics, the question is not would it work. It absolutely objectively would work. The question is, should it be done, how should it be done, and what is actually on the plate to be offered to people. And here endeth the reading. So you can see it was addressed, however briefly, because of course the main topic of that video was not what is actually on the table when it comes to eugenic decisions. The topic was, would eugenics work if you applied it to a human population? Because there are people out there who are actually making this smug pseudo-intellectual, well, what do you mean by work? What is work? Which of course carries with it the implication that it would not work. And also people who are just straight up saying, as was demonstrated earlier, that eugenics would not work. Those people are simply objectively scientifically wrong. You can selectively breed populations, that includes humans. The idea that in a video about one topic I have to address another topic does not follow at all. And again, this is another argument which I'm sick of seeing people make. The idea that a video which is talking about one topic is somehow invalidated because they didn't address another topic which is in a similar sphere. It simply doesn't work. If you were to look at videos as chapters of a book, this would be the equivalent of saying, chapter 1 of the book didn't address something which is in chapter 2 or 3 of a book, therefore chapter 1 is wrong. Or chapter 1 is being somehow intellectually dishonest or disingenuous because it's not addressing things later on in the book. When you make videos which explore a certain topic, or hell, when you make blog posts or comments that explore a certain topic, at some point you have to say, that's enough. You can't go on infinitely, because if you talk about one topic, there will always be little offshoots that you could take, little tangents here or there, where it's like, oh, I mentioned this thing, I could now talk about this thing, but eventually you would end up doing what these far-left idiots love to screech about. You would end up derailing the conversation because you'd end up talking about something completely unrelated to the topic that you're trying to address. So in that video, it started with people saying, oh, what do you mean by work? And some people stating outright that eugenics would not work. Therefore, would eugenics work was the topic of the video. I could have branched off into genetic screening, which we do in humans. I could have branched off into how we are able to alter the genes in utero. I could have gone on a tangent and talked about the concept of designer babies. It was actually mentioned there about selecting eye colour or hair colour and whether we could go even further than that. Go beyond things which are seemingly purely aesthetic. Although I'd argue that eye colour isn't purely aesthetic because there have been shown to be some differences between dark and light eye colours and light exposure and things like that. But that was not the topic of the presentation. The idea that someone staying on topic, as per the title of the presentation, is somehow intellectual dishonesty or disingenuousness, or somehow trying to spread some sort of ideology or masking a true goal is an absurdity. I mean, I could say the very same thing about this comment that was posted. You didn't mention about what exactly would be done if we applied genetics, if we should apply genetics, and to what degree and what lines. You never mentioned any of that stuff in this comment. Therefore, once again, by your own standards, I must assume that you are a Nazi or Nazi adjacent. Do you see why this "you didn't say X, therefore bias" is not an argument? Well, the person who left this comment probably doesn't, but hopefully the people listening to this video did. Just because people can lie or deceive by omission, that doesn't mean that things being omitted is always a lie or a deception. As for this idea of slipping out of a discussion of potential ethical answers to the question of eugenics, I don't like the framing of this statement because it's something that I see a lot of people doing on the internet. They like to frame things just like, oh, you slipped out of this, you sidestepped this. it impugns some sort of motive on it when it's simply not there. Like this idea that it's like, oh, you're hiding something, you're slipping out of something. No, that motive is not there, and you need to stop applying it to people when it doesn't exist. Again, that goes back to the concept of apparently staying on topic makes you bad or wrong or something like that, which is absurd. As to the ethical answer, and of course ethics tends to invoke morality, there probably never will be a moral answer to the question of eugenics. The existence of genes and the reproduction of genes is not a moral good or a moral bad. It merely is. People engaging in mate preference choose which genes are going to be passed on all the time. It is a decision that is made on a daily basis around the world. In order to address that, we would then have to address the concept of people choosing good or bad sexual partners. Because, and we have to put the reminder in here, when someone makes a decision to have sex with someone, that is part of a eugenic decision. It is a biologically informed behavior that does not care about the existence of contraception. That's an argument that I despise seeing because it is completely wrong. This idea that the existence of contraception negates any and all biological underpinnings for sexuality. That is not true. Just because you can take a pill or put a baggie on, that doesn't mean that you are now suddenly sexually attracted to everyone. The basic reproductive underpinnings of the purpose of sexuality being reproduction is still there and is still in play. Therefore, in order to address population eugenics, you have to address good or bad partner preference, which then means you have to address mate selection in humans, which means we have to address things like hypergamy and fertility signifiers. And these are things which I actually do address on this channel every so often, just not in terms of eugenic decision-making. But ultimately this comes back to the morality of a gene reproducing itself, and can that be a moral good or a moral bad? And I don't think there is ever going to be a definitive answer to that question. Certainly not a yes-no answer. It would almost certainly have to be expressed as percentage probability of positive or negative outcomes. But that is another topic for another time. To the person who left this ill-informed comment, I just have to say, seek help, please. This bizarre idea that you have that someone addressing a topic somehow makes them a Nazi, or makes them not a Nazi, or makes them Nazi adjacent, or any other ridiculous concept like this is not a healthy worldview for you to have. This idea that someone addressing a topic while not openly condemning Nazism when Nazism is a footnote in that topic at best is not a healthy worldview for you to have. When you start talking about people masking their true goals, when you have to insert your twisted morality into someone else's head that you can't possibly know what is going on in their brain, when you start having to do that in order to start making condemnations of them, that is not a healthy worldview for you to have. As for people joining me in the wonderful, smooth time of the after hours, I hope this has been somewhat informative for you. Like I said, this comment that was left is a fascinating look into the psychology of a certain type of person. No doubt the kind of person who, if they had a Twitter or Tumblr account, would have a Karl Marx avatar or a hammer and sickle in their username. This bizarre black and white, you are either with me or against me, you are either of my tribe or you are a Nazi, is frankly something special to behold. And hopefully this brief, informal review of this insanity has been somewhat interesting and informative for you.